So let's get on with today's event. We've got a great colleague and friend of mine. We've got Her Majesty's HSE Inspector for Construction Division. We've got Mr. John Heslop, who's going to give us a lovely presentation all about COVID compliance throughout the pandemic and what we have learned from the industry side. And in addition to that, John's also going to talk briefly about some case studies and some statistics from the HSE, which will back up this presentation this morning. So, John, without further ado, thank you very much on behalf of the branch for coming along. Over to you, mate, and good luck.
Thanks very much, Gary. I always get nervous when I'm introduced as Her Majesty's anything, really. I generally just go with Inspector because it sounds a bit too grand for my liking. But no, thanks very much, and thanks obviously to the IOSH members as well for coming on to the meeting today. I feel I should just clarify something first of all, which is about HSE is quite often very reactive in terms of how we're expected to work. We're also very proactive. What we're not always great at doing is getting that balance right. So when Gary asked me to do this presentation months ago, jumped at the chance, said that'd be great, I'd love to do it. I'm an IOSH member, so getting to chat to other IOSH members would be great. And then realised that I'd managed to double book myself with a week days away that I'd promised my wife. So contrary to what Gary thinks, I'm not actually in a shed at the minute. I'm in a Viking hut in the Yorkshire Dales, and if this presentation starts to bore you, chip in. Can we stop the presentation? Can you walk us around this Viking settlement thing? It looks much more interesting. So I'm not in the hut. I haven't come armed with swords and shields, but that's how we've ended up where we are. So thanks very much. I'm just going to try and get my presentation up on the screen, and then we'll go through that and just talk you through. As Gary says, we've got a few things really to go through today. Right, this is the bit before I had some difficulty in. Let's hope this works. Okay, I think that should now be working. Somebody can just let me know because I can't see anybody anymore now.
Yeah, we can see that. Okay.
Yeah,
marvelous, great. That's the first step done, and that's the technical difficulty overcome. So I'm John Heslop. As Gary says, I'm one of the inspectors of health and safety. I work for the construction division within Newcastle office. What I want to do today is just give you a bit of an update about how we found the last year with the pandemic. I also want to give a little talk about what you can expect from us and some of the work we're doing at the minute, which isn't necessarily the sort of run-of-the-mill work that we always do. So today's agenda, really, I'm going to talk you a little bit through about how we're made up, because this is IOSH, Tyne and Weir, so you are likely to meet some of our teams, and I think it's important because we've got quite a diverse team in our office that doesn't always get the full I don't think people fully understand exactly the full range and remit of our office at times. We obviously have Teesside, where we've got quite a lot of coma operators, and we go through manufacturing, construction, everything. So we'll cover that a little bit. There's also been a change recently in our construction sector support team. So our construction sector support team are a central function. They're nationwide. What they do is they liaise with industry and help us with policy support until we ask them really technical questions, in which case they deny all knowledge of what we're talking about, and we have to find a way through it ourselves. I'm going to cover a little bit about what you can expect to see from us sort of the remainder of this year. There's not much left, and into the start of next year. How we target our visits as well. So if you are a duty holder, or if you're providing health and safety advice, hopefully this will give you a little bit better understanding about why we might turn up at your place of work. I've got a bit of COVID-19, which is slightly contentious from an HSE point of view, because I'll cover it when we get to the slide. But as you know, COVID-19 has been massive. There's been a huge push for HSE to ensure that protocols are in place and duty holders are doing what they can to protect staff and members of the public. But actually, in terms of legislation and additional support to allow us to do that, it's been quite scant. So it makes for some interesting reading. I'm not sure whether the powers that be will see that as a particularly good thing or not, and how I'm going to deliver it. And then I'm just going to give you a little touch on the building safety regulator and the latest news we've got on that. What I would hope to do, and what I'm looking to do over the next sort of 6 to 12 months with some of the other groups I work with and other sort of committees I represent, is to see if we can get somebody from the Building Safety Regulator team to come and deliver a presentation and answer some questions. At the minute we have some information about it, but the team dealing with it are obviously very busy looking through the legislative process and making sense of that. So I'd rather, you know, if we can get a really good presentation from them in the future, that's something we can look at from there. So really briefly, and I'm fairly sure on this particular call, I don't need to tell anybody who HSE are, but obviously we go back to 1833 under the Factories Act, which is where we originated. So HSE are where, sorry, that legislation originated. We're an independent regulator with over 40 years experience, and one of the things you realise when we go through successive governments is that every successive government wants to get rid of HSE because we're a terrible burden to business, and that's what the sort of sponsors and promoters tell them. And then we have independent reviews done, and actually we come out looking all right because like anywhere, we have a mix of personnel, but at the end of the day we exist to make people's lives safer, healthier, and work with duty holders to you know, really get that workforce. If you've got a workforce that are happy, content, feel safe, that's one less thing they have to worry about. That's hopefully one more eye they've got on production and helping your business. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit, because that's a bit of a personal mission of mine about how we're seen as versus a regulator and how we work alongside business. But we we basically do that. You know, the legislation that we support and that we regulate is there to help protect millions of people from injury, suffering, and one of the things we see, and I've seen this quite a lot in the last 5 years, just due to some of the cases I've dealt with, is we deal with fatalities from time to time. I have an ongoing investigation at the minute with a double fatality, and it's when you deal with the families and the workforce that are left behind. Not only have you got this terrible tragedy of losing workers and friends and family, but the knock-on effect and the sort of ripple effect that goes out is devastating. And it is a stark reminder, I think, for me, every now and again, of why we do the job we do. I generally do it because I'm quite nosy and I like meeting people and I like questioning people and saying, why did you do that? And what does this do? And it's a great job if that's the kind of person you are. But there is that underlying very serious element of it as well, which is, you know, we are there to make people safe and to work with industry. And I think that's the big thing for me. We're there to work with industry. I think quite often, and even within HSE, we're sometimes seen as being, well, we know what you should be doing and we can tell you what to do. And it's not always the case, certainly not in construction in my mind. My experience in construction, we learn a lot from the industry. And if we can work together with industry, then we can both help each other. So that's where we kind of say that everyone has a part to play, and that's employers, unions, trade associations, professional bodies, academics. We have a science division, and now called, you might know them as the Health and Safety Laboratory. Every few years we seem to change their name just to confuse people, but the science division as of now, and they're based down in Buxton. And essentially just after the Second World War we set up a facility. It was a facility set up for doing various sort of testing of things, and that's in the middle of the Derbyshire Dales. It's just outside Buxton. It's incredibly pretty, but essentially what that lab does is just blow things up all day. So it's again, if you're nosy, if you've got an inquisitive mind, it's a brilliant place to visit. But yeah, so this is kind of what we do. The main things are, you know, we do inspections to help us check how you're managing risks on the day, and that's very much a snapshot. We'll turn up and see how things are at that point. Investigations tend to be a lot more in depth and looking back into management processes and seeing if there's something somewhere along the line that could have helped prevent injury, disease, or ill health. So moving on from there, obviously we're set up across the country. We have offices in various locations. We have a mix of dealing with, obviously we deal with English and Welsh law down in the Newcastle office. Travelling north of the border with Scottish law, and so we have slightly different rules up there, different processes, different procedures that that our Scottish colleagues follow to what we do in England and Wales. Within our office, within HSE, we have some teams that you may not be aware of unless you're working in very specific industries, and one of those is around regulating major hazards. So one of our key purposes obviously is to make sure major hazards are properly managed in those industries where risk control is of the utmost. You know, we're talking about facilities where if there is a major incident, we could be looking at catastrophic harm. workers and the public. And 2 years ago, I got involved in an investigation in which that was a case where there was serious concerns about how the ongoing sort of nature of that site may affect the surrounding area. Because it's ongoing investigation, I can't go into too much more detail, which is probably frustrating because it's a good story in terms of how those bodies come together and regulatory bodies work together in these instances. But the main kind of thing from this is what we do. So we will work in those instances with the police, the fire brigade, we'll work with Environment Agency, sort of major disaster responders and on major incident plans will be involved in those, and they are typically led by two of our divisions, which is the Energy Division and our Chemical, Explosives and Microbiological Hazards Division. And as you can see from the slide, that kind of tells you who we're dealing with. So Energy Division, to be honest, we have some representatives in the office. We don't have a great deal of work with that, but certainly for Chemical, Explosives and Microbiological Hazards, we have a lot of work based within our office. So the Newcastle office covers from the Scottish borders down to the Yorkshire borders and from the coast over to sort of Pennine Way. So we cover quite a large area, and obviously within that there is a lot of that sort of work in Teesside, which the team cover there. So although at different divisions, we tend to work together as well. So I do a lot of work with Chemicals, Explosives and Microbiological Hazards Division, which we call ChemHD, which is much easier to remember because every time I struggle over the M, I always forget what the M stands for when I'm trying to give the full title. But we'll work alongside them. So an example of how that's happening at the minute is that if we've got construction or demolition work happening on, say, a Coma top tier site, then we will come in as the construction division to work alongside ChemHD. And it's interesting, it shows you even within HSE the huge changes and the differences in how we approach industries in terms of what is expected from industry in, I think it's fair to say within construction, we're very concerned on how the work is undertaken and how it's carried out. The paperwork supporting that, the methodologies, risk assessments, absolutely vital. But it's a very dynamic and very changing sort of industry. When we move into things like the factory side of things and some of these Coma top tier sites, it's a relatively static industry. So when it's operating under the same systems all the time and under pretty much the same conditions with some variations. So the paperwork on that side of the industry, in those particular industries, becomes much more pertinent, robust. We would like to see it in much more depth. You understand, obviously, the construction sector, it kind of the industry varies from day to day. The site changes hour by hour. So it has to be a balance and a sensible balance between getting that paperwork and the support and paperwork and methodologies right and actually being able to cope and do the job dynamically. So it comes back to the favourite term in health and safety talk about reasonable practicability. And is it reasonably practical to change paperwork every 2 minutes? That is a decision that has to be made. It's not a decision that I will make because you need to make that for yourself. But they're two of the divisions that we have that people don't often know about. Then we move into the ones everybody generally comes across, which is our Field Operations Directorate. So this is the largest operational directorate we have in the organisation, and these cover all the sectors below. Now, what's interesting is you'll notice that construction fits within there. HSE officially will say to you, because construction is a high risk industry, that's why it has a standalone team. I like to think it's because construction division has just amazing and much more personable inspectors, so we're given a specialist division just for us to be able to engage in certain part of industry. But I say that bravely because I think none of my other FOD colleagues are on the line today. So yeah, we cover agriculture, we'll cover domestic gas safety, obviously former sort of Corgi registered, but you know, gas safety registered and stuff that gets covered on there. The engineering side, entertainment and leisure industry. So if you're based in Newcastle, we will do the Hoppins whenever that comes around. We have inspectors who will go out and look at the rides, and not a job I would particularly envy. You know, I think the reason I fit into being a health and safety inspector is I'm naturally quite anxious. I'm naturally quite risk averse. So even as a kid, I would go to the Hoppins on the town where I'd see these great big sort of like, you know, theme park kind of rides, and I just didn't want to go on. I didn't want to go on. It was too nervous, you know. As a 6-year-old, I was asking about risk assessments, I think. So yeah, so we'll cover that. We cover obviously food and drink manufacture. We would inspect local government if there's an incident there, obviously so that they're not regulating themselves, and manufacturing. We also have within the office, we have specialist inspectors. So you may have come across our specialist inspectors. They assist us in both inspections and investigations. And traditionally, well, normally what they have is many years experience in the sector. So these are people who've come from industry, they've worked in the industry for a number of years in their specialist areas, and then if you like, they sort of go from poacher turned gamekeeper. They come to work with us to advise us on technical details about how things should be managed, how risks should be handled, what kind of things we should be looking for within industry. So to give you an example at the minute, I'm doing a lot of work down in Teesside at the minute. There's a lot of major demolition going on down there to facilitate new industry to be generated. Because we're talking about explosive demolition and high hazard demolition, and demolition of particularly like large and heavy and hefty structures, prefabricated components, I work alongside our construction civil engineering specialist team. So we work hand in hand with reviewing paperwork, site visits, understanding exactly what this sequence of demolition is, how that's going to work. Because my role as an inspector, we are trained as regulatory inspectors, and that's kind of the difference you'll see, is that you have regulatory inspectors and specialist inspectors. The specialist inspectors, as I say, have a vast knowledge from industry. They have generally studied in that field and worked in that field for a number of years before coming to work for us. Regulatory inspectors like myself come from any background, and we are trained in law when we join HSE. So we get trained in health and safety legislation, and then rely on our technical specialists to help us when we need particular expertise around that. You will normally find it's still the regulatory inspectors who take all the horrendous decisions about enforcement. So we may be supported by our specialists, but it will be the regulatory inspectors who put their names on the bit of paper and have the awkward conversation with you. And for all of that, we get paid less than the specialists. But that's just our own fault for not being as clever as them. And we're also supported by fantastic administration and litigation teams. So day-to-day administrative tasks undertaken by the teams, and within that we have some litigation officers. And if you're very lucky, you'll never have anything to do with the litigation officers, because that's solely when we start dealing with prosecutions and going to court. But a brilliant team within our office that without whom we couldn't function. So don't often get the credit that they're due. So just to touch on my team and how we're made up, and this gives you an idea of how other teams are likely to be made up as well. We will have in construction, it's basically the aim is to have 5 inspectors and 2 visiting officers. So we've got our Principal Inspector of Health and Safety, Rob Hurst, who I think I mentioned the Factories Act came in 1833. I think that's when Rob Hurst started working in this field of work. He's been around for years. He tells me he's retiring next year, but I believe that when I say it. He's I'm more concerned about retiring. It's bad enough working for him in the office, but when he retires, he'll have lots of free time on his hands to just drive around and find things that concern him, and then phone them to us, and we'll have to go out and deal with them. Within our team, we've then got 5 inspectors. I'm sure you'll have met some of these people before. You might not be as familiar with the last 2, who are the sort of recent members of the team. Matt has moved over to us from our Carlisle office and has a background in sort of factories and manufacturing inspections. Stuart has come up from Sheffield from a couple of years ago. Stuart had the joy of joining the team before the pandemic. Matt moved on to a new team in the middle of a pandemic, which must be a very awkward situation, and thankfully one I've not been in. And the same for our visiting officers. I'm sure many of you have met Debbie Flynn from Working Well Together events, the shards, various kind of engagement things. But we've also got Steph Sherlow now working alongside Debbie. Both absolutely fantastic members of staff, great sort of representatives of HSE, friendly, outgoing, not sort of, demons with warrants and bits of paperwork. They're really good people. And it was bad enough Matt having to move team within a pandemic. Steph came to work for an entirely new organisation in a pandemic. So the speed at which she's managed to get herself up to a knowledge up to speed and assisting us is truly fantastic. So I mentioned earlier on that we are supported by a sector team who look really at sort of policy and legal support for us. I'm not going to go too much into depth in this, because unless you're specifically in construction, you're not really likely to encounter them. And even if you are, the sort of areas in which this team work, they're unlikely to be people that we come across day to day. What I think is important is to understand from a regulatory inspector point of view. I've talked about we will have specialists, and this bit isn't, again, not specifically, I'm using construction as an example, but you can use this across HSE. So We will work with specialist inspectors for that sort of technical expertise, but we also rely heavily on our sector teams to liaise with industry, to work with industry, to help us clarify points of sort of legal questions. So they've changed recently and they've moved into these sort of areas. It's a sort of more strategic alignment. It makes it, I think, from where we were before, it's a bit more transparent to see who's doing what. We previously had a team with some leads, and they changed a bit. Now we've got sort of specific units, and it makes it much easier to work with. So we have our strategy plan and policy unit, and this is the team that kind of work alongside Cognac, the Construction Leadership Council. So where that was before was during sort of the pandemic, we had our sector team, our strategy plan and policy unit, as they're now known. They were working alongside Cognac and the CLC to devise, the sort of change in daily guidelines of what was safe in the workplace and what was safe on construction sites. We also have that regulatory support unit I talked about, and that's really, you know, for us to get in touch with and ask on very specific matters. And sort of the manufacturing and the engineering teams, they all have this kind of support available to them as well, relevant to their industries and their legislative guidance. Technology and innovation, which is relatively new bit that's been set up, but it's absolutely fantastic. So this is looking at all sort of, you know, what we can be bringing in. I'll be perfectly honest, and this is, I noticed when we sort of letting people into the lobby that IOSH has the disclaimer kind of saying that the presentations are the views and representations of the presenter and not necessarily IOSH. I think at this point I'll probably have to make a disclaimer that some of these views are mine and not necessarily the ones from HSE. But I find that we learn a lot from industry. So in terms of innovation, certainly in the construction industry, the industry is ahead of where HSE is. We know the law, we know the legislation that you need to comply with. What I love to see is how the industry works around that, how it comes up with innovative solutions, new technologies, new ways of working to meet that. And that's absolutely fantastic. And I think we recognise that as an organisation, and we need to embrace that more. And the technology and innovation unit allow us to do that. So they will work alongside sort of outside departments, but we'll then look to bring that in and see how we put that into a learning and development framework for our inspectors, so trainee staff as well, to be able to learn from. You know, and the likes of sort of BIM and things like that at the minute are fantastic. We're starting to see that rolled out more, not so much in the north of England, but certainly colleagues in London are getting access to this sort of, you know, the success of these systems that come in and allow you to sort of walk through a structure before you've even put a spade in the ground. So absolutely fantastic. The asbestos unit, previously ALU, they rejoined sector, but effectively do the same role they've been doing for years. So they are a port call for asbestos matters. In terms of asbestos licensing, we do as well also rely on specialist support. So our occupational hygienists fit into the category of specialist inspectors I was talking about before. And if you've had the joy meeting some of our occupational hygienists, they are a very mixed crew. They're great backgrounds, great personalities, and a lot of knowledge there. So we tend to work obviously in construction quite closely with them when we're dealing about the asbestos side of things for obvious reasons. So what can you expect from us in the remainder of this year and next year? So our plan of work, I've covered here again. This is very construction sort of heavy today, and I apologise for that. With hindsight, maybe could have lightened it up and made it a bit more general. But what I was trying to do is show you that within one division, this is how we're set up. Other divisions pretty much replicate this. So each division will have its own plan of work and how it intends to go about things. So for construction, we have the proactive inspections, which should make up, in theory, 50% of our time. And these are where we're out. These are the really good ones. These are the ones you love to see as a duty holder or a consultant, where we just turn up out of the blue and say to you, hi, here, all right, come around, look around your site, have a chat around your risks and see how you're managing things. And these are the bits where directors go funny colours and are sometimes quite reluctant to speak to us at first. Within those proactive inspections for construction, we do two extra kind of areas as well. So we have the licensed asbestos removal inspections that I talked about before. If you're a licensed asbestos removal company, you notify HSE through an ASB5 that you're going to be removing some licensed asbestos, and we have a sort of targeted area to look at in terms of how many duty holders should receive inspections. You know, if you've got a major national licensed asbestos removal company, we have to make sure that we're not sort of going out and seeing them in every patch they're in, because that would just be, you know, it would be unfair. It'd be too much on top of them. Likewise, when we've got some smaller operators, we need to make sure that we're regulating those as well. So we have targeted visits, normally looking around 3 per year for each duty holder. We also have a respiratory risk focused initiative. So if you are working within the construction sector, I hope this doesn't come as a shock, but we're in the middle of one at the minute. So October sees our respiratory risk focused initiative, and that's a real focus on the health initiative, we call it. It's about the risks from dust, and I'll touch a bit on that in a little while. It doesn't detract from the safety issue. We will deal with those visits the same way we would with anything else, but our targeting of the visits changes slightly. So if we come on site and there's work at height issues, we'll still deal with work at height issues, but we are maybe looking to target these industries in October, or parts of the industry where we know that dust could be an issue, so silica, wood dust, asbestos, obviously. The other 50% of the work that we do, or how the 50% ideals, how things are made up, will be investigations. So concerns that come in from members of the public, workers can raise any sort of concern with us about work and activity, and within 4 months we have to have resolved that issue. It tends to be within construction, the majority of cases we get are work at height issues. People have seen somebody working at height, they think it's unsafe, and they want us out there to deal with it. So we'll try and deal with that. Fatal and non-fatal incidents we try and conclude within 12 months. So we don't want in either of these cases for investigations. Concerns may be legitimate, they may not, we'll deal with that. Fatal and non-fatal incidents, we've had an incident there, and we need within 12 months in that tight frame, we need to work out what's happened. Is anybody at fault for it? If so, what do we do about that? But more importantly, how do we make sure that it doesn't happen again? And that should be shared across the organisation, so we can share that learning with industry. Obviously, we're still supporting the UK's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, although in the last few weeks, everywhere I've gone, it appears that nobody cares anymore. I don't mean that in a professional capacity. I mean, when I'm out day to day, masks, etc., just seem to be a thing of the past already. So could be interesting to see how that develops, if at all, given the figures we're seeing in cases. We assist in bringing into being the building safety regulator, and I'll touch a little bit about that. I've mentioned that we support Cognac and CLC. And then that the innovation support unit, we're now looking at how we enhance and develop division skills, knowledge and training. And we also do some high hazard construction activities. Now this is what I'm personally involved in quite heavily at the minute. So the decommission and dismantle of offshore structures onshore. So former sort of offshore installations now being floated ashore, and then once they're on dry land, they come under the CDM responsibilities and duties. While they're out at sea, our energy division are responsible for that. So if you think back to the start, a couple of slides when I was talking about our different divisions, we are doing some work with energy division based up in Scotland, because that's the area where things are coming to for us in Teesside to be demolished, and also localized demolition. So the Tees worked site, the former British Steel site, that's becoming Tees Port. Teesworks Freeport, I think it's going to be. So some major redevelopment there, and we're working on both of those in a slightly different manner. We do what we call a strategic engagement. So we start to work with a company before they even have, in terms of the offshore stuff, the assets. We start to ask about the planning, and we get in really early, which has two things really. It means that we can hopefully resolve some of the fee for intervention work, because we can remove that difficulty if we are not if the work is live and ongoing. If we're doing it in the pre-planning stage, we can influence that work, and we can move it away from potential breaches or where we think there could be weaknesses. So we are getting to a point where we don't approve the work, we won't sort of sign off paperwork, that's not what we do, but we get to a point where we say, actually, we're quite content that you've managed the risks, and you seem to have considered them and have suitable mitigation in place. And at that point, we will hopefully step out and let you just get on with your work. So quite interesting in terms of what we're doing. We've talked a bit about how we target visits, and we really use those radar stats. So the radar stats could come through to us a bit faster. That's not a criticism of you, that's a criticism of HSE, sorry, in terms of how we collate that information and how we use it. But it's basically, and I'm not going to go through each one of these points because you can see them on the slide there, but it's this kind of information that we use to target where we're going to go. So this kind of information will be used to target which factories or manufacturing areas we want to go to. We use it within construction to look at the particular subsections of the construction industry that have the most reported risks or injuries or ill health with them. So we'll use that information, and that sort of channels where we're going to go to and how we're going to target them. And unfortunately, you know, one of the things we get through is we'll get an update every day on the number of workers killed. So we don't get stats coming out about every injury or every investigation, but every time there's somebody killed on a construction site or through construction work, we will be given an update, and it'll be specific to that person and tell us what happened and what is believed to have happened pending an investigation. And sometimes that can be quite, we're starting to see statistics sometimes now where an incident can happen 4 months ago, and 4 months later that person can die and it's the result of those injuries, but it's still classed as a construction death, and it's still something that you know, it's appalling, and we would hate. We should be in a situation ideally where we're never faced with that. And all we can do is continue to work with industry and continue to work with yourselves, and work with health and safety professionals wherever we can to try and influence that and reduce the risks to people's health and safety. So a big thing for us, as I said before, is tackling the occupational disease. I think the safety risks are pretty obvious, and they've always been pretty well understood, that if you fall off a roof, it's going to hurt pretty instantly. The occupational disease is slightly different in that, you know, because workers don't necessarily feel ill that day or the next day or the day after that, it kind of gets overlooked. And it's actually that build-up of, as you can see in this picture, that build-up of dust inhalation or exposure to some of these things down the left-hand side of the slide, that over time, that's when they can start to build and give us latency health problems. And you know, one of the clearest cases of that is asbestos and the mesothelioma numbers, which, you know, hopefully will start to go down and reduce now, with asbestos being much more, I think, still, you know, don't get me wrong, as a construction inspector, it baffles me the amount of sites I turn up and say, have you got an asbestos survey? And the answer would be no, and they're ripping the internals of the building out, and it's still worrying. But I think that knowledge is becoming better. The industry is changing, that there's, you know, the legislation now prevents you building with asbestos. So over time, hopefully we'll see that reduction, and you know, that goes for all the other sort of substances down the side there as well. You know, the innovation, and I was talking about before, some of that innovation isn't in ways just to meet legislative needs. Some of that is around how do we stop using these substances, what else can we use, what can we substitute, and going back to that hierarchy of control. So preventative steps, you know, just going on to that a bit more, and I was saying we're in a sort of health initiative at the minute for construction. These are the key things we're looking for. You know, we're looking at asbestos safety, to have that survey for all the workers on site to be appropriately trained, and I think that's a key point as well. Is it's not just the basic asbestos awareness training; it depends what level you're doing as to what training you require. Silica, you know, again, can we change the task? The hierarchy control, can we just not do it in the first place? Sometimes that's unavoidable, so what do we look at then? And it's about how we use that dust suppression on tool extraction. You know, for everything we do with RPE, PPE is the last line of defence really, and we don't want to see that. And wood dust is a big one during the refurbishment sort of work that we do. The refurbishment industry, there's a lot of kind of, you know, wood dust exposure. There's wood dust available, help yourself. To be honest, I've been on some sites where you get bagfuls of the stuff off the floor, and that's really an indication that things aren't being managed well. But yeah, there's a lot of exposure still, and it's just trying to understand that and control that in a better way. A lot of, you know, the equipment you buy now will come with on tool extraction. Quite often it's not actually very good. You know, it's a bag that actually all the respirable dust just flies out the back of, so it's a bit pointless. It's better than nothing, but it's really not very good, and it's not adequate. So it's about just you know, we want to see that people have taken those steps, that they've thought through and come up with suitable mitigation. Consequences specifically for the construction industry are pretty well known, really. So we talk about mesothelioma. Young men born in the 1940s in the construction industry, it's about 46% of that, if the mesotheliomas are from that. We live in the northeast. We speak to people who worked in shipyards and stuff as younger men, where they used to have snowball fights with asbestos, roll it up, throw it at each other. So, you know, a lot of it we talk about is knowledge, and it's that knowledge of how do we share that knowledge with the workforce who generally just want to come to work and do their job and go home paid at the end of the day. How do we get them on board with health and safety? How do we make sure that they understand the risks they're dealing with? And that's the challenge really, isn't it? That's a challenge for all duty holders, is to get that message across. and really get the workforce to understand that with all the best intention in the world, duty holders can put so much process policies in place, but unless you get that buy-in from the workforce, it doesn't really count for a lot. In a big area that we've got to start, for me, in HSE doing more with, this is again somewhere where the industry is much further ahead of us, is around stress, depression, anxiety. It's about the mental health. We have not shied away from it, but I think we're very reluctant to sign off on things at the minute, until we're very sure that they're proven. In a typically HSE risk-averse way. You know, we don't want to put our name to anything that we're not 100% sure of. And again, that's an interesting thing. If our official sort of guidance for staff during COVID pandemic was to go out and, you know, look at the mask wearing and stuff, but actually HSE's position on mask wearing was an interesting one, shall we say. So, you know, we've got rate for musculoskeletal disorders in construction are significantly higher than other industries. But there's a lot of sort of evidence that supports that, because it's easier to ring your boss and say, I can't come in, I've damaged my back, than to say, I can't come in, I mentally cannot cope today, I'm in such a dark place, I can't work. And I think we've got to get better as a regulator at seeing how we assist duty holders in doing this. And this is what I talked about before. It's not just for me about HSE coming out and hitting you with a stick and saying, you need to do this. It's about us coming out and saying, how do we work with you? What can we do to support you as duty holders to support your workforce, to make sure the workforce are healthy and safe? So, you know, the research from 2019 as well that ties into this mental health stuff is that workers in the construction industry were 3 times more likely to take their own lives than those working outside it. Now, the pandemic has had a massive impact on people's mental health and the way people think about things. And I think I can't see that number, unfortunately, going down. I can see it rising as a result of the pandemic. So really, for me, massive work to be done in that area by HSE. Talking about everybody's favourite topic, the pandemic, I'm only going to briefly touch on this because, I'll be perfectly honest, I think people have been sort of suffering COVID fatigue by now. It seems eased off a bit, but I think there was a point, certainly last year, when guidance was changing so daily, things were so uncertain on a day-to-day basis that really people were almost sick of hearing about COVID. And it sounds ridiculous given how serious an issue it was and how seriously it affected industry and affected people's personal health. But it is it's a fact that people were sick of it. So the general advice for us is still the same as it was before. You know, keeping that safe space, washing your hands regularly. This is the information we were given when we were going out last year. And fantastically, as a slight aside, so HSE doesn't own the Newcastle office. We rent a sort of area of the building from another government department. It's the massive HMRC site along Benton, if you're familiar with it. So we're tucked up in a little corner up there. But the office at first didn't meet HSE. When lockdown first happened, it didn't meet HSE's sort of COVID control rate. So we were all working from home. And then there was a bit of discussion about we would sort of wind back in on proactive inspection at first, just to allow people to kind of adjust and to mitigate the risk of how many people were coming through your door. So the only sites we went to were those sites where we were led to believe that COVID controls weren't in place. So it was fantastic. As inspectors, we had to work from home to be safe. We had to not go out on proactive inspections to be safe, but we were fine to go out to the sites where people we thought might be at risk. So it was particularly interesting and particularly challenging, I think, depending on the kind of industry you work in, as to how you could meet these controls. So, you know, we follow the government guidance. Whatever the government guidance is, we will follow. We will then work with Cognac and CLC to try and get in place stuff for the construction industry. And that is the same for all other industries. You know, our other sort of sectoral support teams will be working with them. I think the interesting thing is that in that pandemic, we HSE handled over 316,000 COVID inspections. So these were classed as COVID spot checks. This is where we went out and quite often alongside a normal routine inspection, we would be doing a COVID check. So if we came to your place of work because we believed there was, or we were led to believe there were some issues with COVID controls, whilst there, we would then do an inspection as well. From over 316,000, there's been one prosecution. And one case in which there's been a prosecution, there were numerous other breaches on site. So there was a number of health and safety breaches on site. It wasn't solely a COVID thing. This is a bit where I probably don't get very HSE, and this is more me talking. But when the pandemic broke out, we were given a budget to deal with that. But with no real kind of sort of like understanding of what that budget was for. What we did have was a lot of small print that said what we couldn't use the budget for. And what we didn't have was any sort of additional legislation put through. So we were working very much off existing legislation, the sort of vague wording of sections 2 and 3 of the Act. If we were in construction, we were looking at Regulation 13.4C. Within CDM, it was the management regs in other areas of business where we were looking to see, did you have welfare facilities that would support it? And really, I feel a lot of this was done where this was a great example of how we could work with industry. It was much more about us having those collaborative chats about what could be done rather than necessarily hitting people over the head with a stick about what they should or shouldn't be doing. So COVID-19, obviously the pandemic, the coronavirus, however we refer to it, still a major factor in lives. I was sort of talking to my wife last night. I put my hand in my pocket to get something and pulled out a face mask. And I think if I thought back sort of 2-3 years ago, if I was with somebody who randomly pulled a face mask out of their trouser pocket in the pub, I would think, well, I'm not entirely sure what's going on. Now that's run of the mill, and we're a lot more cautious and we give things more thought about personal interaction. And again, tying that back to mental health in the workplace, you know, that human interaction is vital just to get by day to day. So we have a lot of considerations to make in how we go about it. But for this was, you know, it was an unknown. It wasn't a situation we'd found ourselves in before. And I think between industry and HSE, we work well on trying to tackle those areas around COVID-19. So please keep doing what you're doing. Please keep it safe. We've personally, in my family, we've lost people who've passed away due to COVID, sadly. And I think it's affected every sort of walk of life, hasn't it? So I don't think there's any more I need to say on that. If you're really unaware of what COVID is or the protocols or what you think you could be doing, then it'd be great to have a chat with you, because I'm not sure where you've been. So the Building Safety Regulator, as I say, I'm not going to touch too much on this. I'm going to kind of do a little bit of a whistle-stop tour on it just to give you the latest update I've got. But hopefully we'll start to see some more stuff coming out in the very near future as well. So as everyone's aware, Grenfell Tower disaster, absolutely awful situation, awful turn of events, and it commissioned an independent review of building regulations and fire safety. And that was led by our former chair of HSE, Dame Judith Hackett. Our chair is now Sarah Alban, who's been in post for a few years. We had David Snowball in between for an interim period as well. So there's been a sort of constant sort of handover of that position and some changes in how we operate as a result of having different chairs. But in this particular instance, obviously, Judith Hackett had already left the organisation, and so her resultant Building a Safer Future report made a number of recommendations, which I'm sure we're all pretty much aware of, where HSE would be named as the new regulator. And the idea being that they'll oversee safe design, construction, occupation. It's to kind of try and align things between planning and eventual sort of outcome, if you like. So they're going to implement this new, more stringent regulatory regime for high-risk residential buildings. There is a whole raft of kind of selective criteria available on that. To promote confidence amongst industry professionals and regulators to raise those standards up, and then oversee performance systems of all buildings. So we currently have an HSE team working alongside all sort of bodies you can see on the bottom slide there, and that's to review all the proposed legislation, to look at it, to try and iron out how we actually deliver that. And I think one of the interesting challenges, being on a construction team, is that we are looking at a building safety regulator team who are very heavily front load a process and project. And it's going to be interesting to see how we then hand that over. So how do we then transition that into CDM? How do we make sure there's no overlap? Because there will be, undoubtedly, there'll be areas of overlap. And that's one of the things we need to look at, is how we enforce that and how we make sure that we're not this burden to business that we're quite often referred to as, that we're actually there supporting things and making business safer. So your 3 gateway points are as you've got on here. So the buildings have to be 18 metres or more in height, or 7 more stories. Then they have these various gateways you have to go through. So one is, demonstrating that the plan application incorporates thinking about fire safety, and that there's the fire safety specialist sort of expertise involved. And we have that expertise as well within our organisation, within our science division, etc. So they are heavily involved in this work. Gateway 2, obviously, is then the both in the current building control deposit plan stage. You can see from there. So it'll only be for those in-scope buildings. It won't be the ones that fall out with the criteria. And then there's a hard stop at that point. So everything stops while it's reviewed and while it's approved. Once it's approved, then you move on and you start looking at sort of gateway 3. And that's where there'll be final inspections and a completion certificate before sort of anything is handed over. So that essentially is all I wanted to cover with you today. There's a ream of stuff. I feel like I could probably talk to you for hours, days, but nobody deserves that, really. Nobody deserves to have HSE talk to them for that length of time. So thank you very much for your attention. The good thing about, I find, doing sort of online things is I can't see if you're glazing over and falling asleep, which is quite off-putting when it's face-to-face. Certainly, Lynn, I don't know if you've had any questions or anything, but I'm quite happy to try and deal with anything that might have come in.
Well, up to now, oh, here we go. From Joe Elliott. There seems to be a lot of confusion out there about when COVID should be rid or reported, particularly what constitutes a workplace exposure. Can you clarify the current position, please? That's a nice one for you, John.
Thanks very much. Just make a note who asked that, Lynn. I'll chase them up later on. Yeah, the difficulty we've had around COVID is we had, in the early days, we had quite a few RIDOs reported into us. I'll be perfectly honest, the difficulty we have with them is exactly what you said there. How do we, there's very little way we can prove a workplace sort of incident, that we can say, that we can definitively say, yes, it was passed on in the workplace, that's the only place it can come from. So we did some initial checks, and I was involved in a few of them when the RIDOs first came in for COVID, and it was really a case of getting in touch with the company. If you can show that you've got your COVID protocols in place, the likelihood is that we will not be investigating anything further. With that said, that is the difference between RIDO reportable and then what we might investigate. To be honest, I think we might have a change coming in the COVID reporting. So rather than give a definitive answer today, what I'll do is I'll chase that up with our team, and then I'll provide an answer back through IOSH, if that's okay, and then we can share that out with members if that works. But just from an experience level, that's exactly the difficulty we've had previously. We had give you an example of one I dealt with was two site managers. We had a site manager going on holiday and another site manager coming in to take over. They did a handover for half a day within the site office, and then the sort of incoming site manager got diagnosed with COVID. I think within 4 days or some 3 or 4 days. The outgoing manager who was supposed to go on holiday didn't go on holiday because he had to isolate. So the likelihood was, yes, it could have come from there, but there's actually no way of definitively proving that it did. What we did with the company is check their COVID protocols, check what they had in place. We did a site visit to see how it was set out, and we were satisfied that really everything that could be done had been done. Therefore, whilst it was reported to us, there wasn't sort of any outcome from it. And I think that's one of the distinctions to make as well, is that quite often, I know in terms of stats and from your side of things and how it can affect business, it's not great if you've got to report something, but sending in a RIDO report does not always mean that HSE will come out and investigate it. But in terms of the COVID aspect, I'll chase that up and get a definitive answer sent out.
Brilliant.
That appears to be the only question for you today, John. You're off the hook.
Great, that's it. Let's log off quickly then. Let's log off quickly.
Oh,
no,
on.
I mean,
here's another one. Sorry, people must be thinking about them now. This is from Michael McBride. What is the HSC's view on the COVID situation regarding teachers and pupils in school?
We generally probably will not have an official one because we will pass that off to local authority with our Teflon shoulders, I would imagine. But yeah, there's very much a change depending on what industry you're in and where you work as to the guidance you seem to be getting. As I say, the closest we're able to do is kind of work with those agencies we are responsible for regulating, but where we don't regulate those industries in schools at the minute are one. There was a lot of talk that we were going to be going into schools at one point. That didn't seem to materialise. So yeah, we really at the minute we wouldn't have an official response on that, I'm afraid.
Right, one more from Satnam. We understand HSE have removed COVID measures, but what is the advice being given to industry to clarify removed COVID measures within their workplace?
So I think if I'm right, talking about sort of HSE no longer expect to see COVID measures in in the sites in which we enforce. We would still be expecting to see some level of protocol. You know, we are aware that this pandemic still classed as ongoing. There's been a massive sort of relaxation across the country, as I mentioned before, and how people seem to be approaching it. But we would still expect to see organisations and duty holders taking some responsibility for that. The infection rates are high. We would expect, therefore, for you to take it as if any other sort of risk, you know. And I think most organisations have those measures in place and have had for the last 18 months to 2 years. Therefore, I don't think it's too onerous to expect that they remain in place.
Okay, Leslie Salkel, right, nice compliment. Hi, John, great presentation. What is HSA's only one line? What is HSA's recommendation regarding adequate ventilation in workplaces?
Right, yeah, this is a really contentious point. So thankfully I work in construction and everyone just says we work outside, it's great. But yeah, we've had a discussion about this recently in terms of ventilation within buildings, because there's been this kind of, you know, unofficial line, I think, keep the windows open, keep doors open if you can. There are obviously implications around that in terms of, we've had to say to people, if we're saying prop doors open, we don't mean fire doors. Don't let your fire doors be staying open. But also we move into a slightly different element of it now as well, as we're starting to get towards winter. So there's a lovely element of keeping the windows open and keeping that ventilation coming through, which is fine when it's a bit warmer. When it starts to get a bit colder, then that obviously has implications as well. The hard and fast rule doesn't seem to be in writing. It's very much like usual, as you will get from HSE, is it comes down to sort of risk assessment and risk management. You know, is it reasonably practicable for you to keep that room ventilated in an appropriate manner, given how many people may be working in it? If not, what else can you do? You know, in terms of sanitizers, masks, things like that. But yeah, so far I haven't seen anything that's come out that will give us a definitive, you know, in a way that we might have for asbestos. We expect to see so many air changes an hour. There's nothing like that, because we're not expecting it to be measured. It's not reasonably practicable for every industry to measure how much sort of ventilation is in a room. So I think the guidance seems to be very much ventilate where you can, and where you can't, see if there are any other controls you can put in place.
Right,
not definitive. Sorry, I'm aware.
Thick and fast now. This is from Adrian Hull. If we encountered an unsafe gas situation in a domestic property, should it be reported only to Gas Safe or HSA as well? We have always worked to the former, but I was surprised to see domestic gas on your list in the presentation.
Yeah, so what we have is a team who will deal with domestic gas situations where we have trying to think of a better phrase other than sort of like, you know, dodgy installers really. So we will deal with gas safety will generally come to us. So if you reported a gas safety, that's fine. Anything that needs to come to HSE, they will feed on from there. And it's probably best that I would say, leave it like that, so that we're not receiving duplicate reports. But we will work to chase up. We will prosecute gas installers if they are found to be in breach. So we have a team dedicated to that. But yeah, that existing process, that would be my first call. Go report it to gas safety, and from there, there's protocols in place for them to notify us if we need to become involved at all in that. Right.
Oh gosh, thick and fast now. I think Gary, what time are you calling it an end? 11, because we've got four more questions.
Yeah. I mean, what I can do as well, if there's more questions come in, I'm quite happy if you want to send them through, and I'll sort of give a written formal response and we can send that out. Right,
well, we'll do these four, and I think right. Okay. This is from Graham Sutherland. Will there be any updated guidance on WFH? Pandemic saw people having to WFH, often creating workstations using best endeavours, but as businesses return to the office using COVID secure measures and new hybrid working patterns, new challenges are faced by employers, such as half-time at home, half in office. Is it expected to have full DSE setups at both home and the office, for example? WFH guidance seems to be more focused on temporary setups as opposed to a dual workstation location.
I think, in short, the answer to all of that is yes. I would expect to see it adequately controlled at both. If your employer, for whatever reason, is expecting you to work from home, you're still engaged in a work activity, therefore there is still a need to look after you. to that end, and I can say this is, I'm not always, even though I work for them, I'm not always HSE's biggest advocate, but very quickly into the pandemic, because we work from home, we were issued with a sort of DSE questionnaire to fill in from home about workspace, what we had available, and if we didn't have desks available at the right height, so you know, people working from coffee tables or dining tables, if they weren't at a specified height, then HSE provided us with desks. So desks were sent out. If we had specialised chairs in the office, those chairs were shipped to home. So that was all sort of very quickly done. We are now starting to see people return to the office, and that is a question that internally we're still asking, which is, so we've got all this kit at home, are we now supposed to duplicate it and have it in the office as well, especially when you talk about, you know, certain you'll have certain equipment as DSE assessment that can range from like your keyboards, your mouse, your chair, your desk, any of that. The answer would be yes. If you're expected to work, it shouldn't be that, you know, there has to be a sort of grace period, if you like. You know, we're not expecting that you get told one day you're working from home and everything is there instantly, but there's got to be that sort of thought process, that risk mitigation, and that attention to making sure that you are safe and healthy, and that doesn't stop just because you're working from home. Now, the only issue I've got around that is to what extent we would enforce that, because it's unlikely we're going to come out and do an inspection in your house, and also it would depend on the industry you work in and who you work for as to whether or not who is the enforcement authority for that and who would chase that up. But yes, in short, your employer should not be treating you any differently in terms of your health and safety just because you're working from home instead of an office.
And this one fits nicely into that one. Does the HSE have social distancing in place in its offices?
It does, yeah. So we have a road. Well, to be honest, health and just as a quick personal view, when I started training with health and safety, there's me and my friend started at the same time, and we used to say all the time, seeing the health and safety inspectors for HSE, they're a bit odd, aren't they? And then we realised that we were the same people. So yeah, we're all a bit odd, so we tend to stay away from each other at the best of times. But within our office, we have an office protocol. So we have our desks are still in the formation they used to be, but there are now certain desks you can't use to achieve spacing. So generally we'll have a bank of 4 desks and every other desk is available to be used. But we also have a sort of live updated spreadsheet we can go into at any point via Microsoft, which will tell us who's in the office, and you fill that in to see whether you're going in, and spaces are limited within the office. It is mandatory that we wear our masks until we arrive at the desk. You can take them off at your desk if you want to, you don't have to. Hand sanitizer available. There's kind of like one-way systems around the floor. So yeah, we are for once doing what we tell everybody else to do, which hasn't always been the case.
Okay. Second,
final one.
The two more. Tunde said thank you for the presentation. You talked about a single presentation. I think he means prosecution resulting from over 300,000 COVID-related inspections. Can you talk about that particular case or not?
It's not one I had great knowledge of. It was in Manchester. What had happened, in the Manchester area somewhere. We'd had reports, I believe there'd been a concern raised around the COVID sort of measures in place, as well as everything else. When we got there, there was other measures around, so there were work at height issues. I can't remember all the other breaches, so I won't sort of guess at them, but there were more than those breaches. Improvement notices were served on the site for what we wanted to see done. There was very little comeback from the duty holders during that period, and when the compliance check was done, nothing had been done to make general improvements. One of the areas in there was COVID, so the prosecution, it was one prosecution, not one presentation, sorry. But yeah, the one prosecution involved in range of things, and I think that's a bit, I meant when I was kind of saying some of it is a bit contentious, that I think HSE would probably as an organisation prefer to have a sort of harder, more impressive line of statistics behind it about how COVID was tackled. The 316,000 inspections with a relatively limited workforce is great, is incredible, and what I would hope is that we were able to steer in you know, any instances where things weren't right, we could steer them in the right way. But in terms of formal action, then yeah, there was only the one prosecution, and it wasn't solely COVID related. It was tied in with a number of things on that site, and probably came more under failure to comply with improvement notice.
Yeah. Okay, last one. This is from Kirk Douglas. Will the BSR be putting guidance out on what information he wants to see in the safety cases for high-rise building?
It will, yes, definitely, and it better hard do, because as an inspector who regularly deals with CDM, I need to see where this overlap occurs and what we do. But yeah, it definitely will be. I think we hopefully would have had it a bit already in place by now, or I'll certainly be able to share it. But because of the way in which that's going about, we haven't at the minute. But that will kind of what I alluded to earlier. I'm very keen that we get somebody from Building Safety Regulator in a position soon that can start delivering very specific sort of presentations on that and give you the full ins and outs of what can be expected.
Thank you very much, John. You weren't put on the spot.
That's great. That wasn't too bad. It's been a lot worse at times, but no, thank you very much to everyone for listening. And if anyone's got any further comment or questions, I'm not sure the protocol, can they sort of fire those to you, Helen, and then can you pass those on to me?
Yeah, if anything's put into the chat or they email us, yeah, we can get them to you, so that won't be a problem.
Excellent. That's great. Thank you very much, and thanks everyone for your time. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, John.
Okay, just a couple of things just before we all log out. Thank you very much, John. Fantastic presentation, and that's obviously been mirror image from one or two of the members this morning. So brilliant, mate. Especially when you're on holiday in your igloo. Watch out!
It's a Viking pit. It's not an igloo. It's a Viking pit.
Ben Fogel will probably be turning up before long. So never mind.
The problem I've got now is Claire, my wife, wants to build one of these out the back garden for the kids.
A great job, John. Thank you very much. Great update. Great tips. I'm sure there's a lot of people got a lot from that, and they'll take that back to their workplaces. And a great overview of the Newcastle division, John. It's a good. It's a bit enlightening when you kind of put it all down in slides and you explain how you work. So thank you very much for that.